So welcome to a new discussion video. This is on the topic of genre in books, and I'm going to talk about it both as someone on the inside as a writer, but also as a reader. And it all stems from, a few years ago I read a brilliant book called House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski. I think that's how you pronounce it. And it's a book that's very, very ingenious in its form and its formatting. So there's lots of unreliable narrators, there's lots of narrators following up the storylines of other narrators. There's one of the narrators is a guy writing a book about a documentary that doesn't seem to exist, which is a very strange concept because documentaries, I mean, they can be scripted, but the whole, they differ from feature films in that they're sort of supposed to be sort of portraying reality as you go along through the lens of a camera. So why, how can you write about that if that film doesn't even exist? There's stuff about mental health, which calls into question the reliability of the narrators, and there's a house that's a bit like Doctor Who's TARDIS that just seems to sort of continually expand, and there's lots of formatting stuff where the sort of words are sort of form shapes on the page. It's a book about architecture of the house, but it's also a sort of architecture on the page, and it just brings it all together, these disparate elements, and you realise it's a story about a long-term marriage that's sort of in decline and sort of falling apart, and the disintegration of a family, and it's a stupendous book. And I went online to Goodreads because I wanted to see what other people were saying about it, and most of the commentators there were extolling the book and lavishing praise on it, but they were lavishing praise on it as a horror genre book, which never entered my mind, the entire time I read it. And then I thought, well, judging by these comments, the notion of this book as literary fiction, or the notion of this book as postmodern, because it does use sort of quite a few postmodern techniques, never entered the minds of the people who are sort of judging it as a horror genre. But there's no problem with that. There's no problem with me never imagining for one moment that it's a horror genre book, and there's no problem for one moment for the horror fans, not realising that this book is highly, highly literary. It's only genre, when that intercedes, that then we suddenly have to sort of put these labels on. And that's what I want to sort of talk about in this video, that I see genre as diminishing the reader, diminishing the author, and diminishing the book. To me, the whole concept of tagging books as genre adds no value. Now, I understand why we have genre, because if you think about it, if you only have fiction and non-fiction, how do bookshops organise the displays so that readers can find what they want? Because if a bookshop was just completely fiction, and then non-fiction, how does the reader sort of key into an area of books that they like? So I totally understand that's why bookshops do it. I always had this idea for a bookshop that they should arrange books by sort of theme. So let's say you had a theme of London, so you'd have a table of books, obviously novels about London or novels set in London, but you'd have history books about London, you'd have psychogeography, there's a lot of that happening in London at the moment, you'd have travel guides and tour guides, and then you'd have the quirky stuff. But you can't do that for a whole bookshop because books cut across different themes and stuff. At best, you could have one table of that. So again, I totally understand why books are divided up into labels to make it sort of smaller sections for people to be able to find their books. And it's even worse online because, of course, it uses algorithms, and you have 3 tag labels to choose from on Amazon. And then a sort of a mathematical algorithm sort of does the rest of the work for you, which is just nonsensical. Whenever I'm asked as an author, what genre do you write? It's a question that always leaves me stumped because I don't write genre. I don't set out to write genre. Although I might have an idea in my mind of my type of reader, I'm not writing for that with that person in mind. I'm writing the book I want to write, and hopefully it will find its readers. Now, having said that, I've written 5 novels, 2 of which could be viewed as genre, and one which was consciously an attempt on my part to mediate with the concept of genre. So one of them could be sort of sci-fi. It's loosely based on the first Terminator movie, and it is a time travel movie, but it's very much set in the present, really. But for me, the key thing why I don't regard it as science fiction is the structure of it. The narrative form of it is sort of wildly inventive, because I've used two scientific theories to structure the book around, and the book sort of mirrors both of these theories. One is Schrodinger's cat, which, if you don't know, is that thought experiment of, if you have a cat inside a box, and inside that box is a poison capsule, and the very act of opening the box will either break open the capsule and kill the cat, or the capsule remains intact and the cat's alive. So it's not until the act of opening the box do you know whether the cat's alive or dead, but the act of opening the box also determines whether it will be alive or dead. So that's a sort of mainstay of quantum mechanics. So my structure embodies that, and it also embodies the butterfly effect from chaos theory, which sort of states that a butterfly flapping its wings in one country can set off an earthquake or a tidal flood right across the other side of the world. And the theory about this is it's really about sort of opening conditions, that no matter how repetitive sort of studies of events are, earthquakes, tidal waves or whatever, a small change in the opening circumstances before this event lands can have a wildly different outcome. So my book basically, at the heart of it, takes a scene between a man and a woman, and it's a seduction scene, and replays it in 8 different ways, where a slight different reaction for one of the participants in this seduction scene leads to a wildly different outcome. So it's quantum in the sense of, is the seduction successful or is it not? But it's also this sort of butterfly effect, where a slight difference in circumstance just takes it off in a whole new direction. And for me, that was the interest in writing the book. It's not the science fiction elements. And it embodies, scientific theory, but they're both theoretical, really. They're not sort of observable science, although the chaos theoreticians might argue that it is. So to me, it's not a book about genre. It's not looking to do what science fiction normally looks to do. So that's that one. Now the other one, which was called An Eye for an Eye for an Eye, was very much concerned with genre. So it's a police procedural, it's paranormal, and it's dystopian. Only I very consciously looked to subvert all 3 of those. So it's a police procedural, but the guy in it is not a policeman. It's paranormal in that the 2 protagonists, or the protagonist and the antagonist, both have psychic powers. But in the novel, you discover, what's really behind these powers, and there's not this sort of supernatural, paranormal thing motivating these powers at all. And it's dystopian on one level. But I was very concerned with contemporary politics, because when I wrote this book, it was at the time of the Eurozone crisis in Europe, when the currency was collapsing and countries like Greece and Italy were basically going bust. And it was a book that asked the question, what happens when a country does go bust? It can no longer have pay for an army to defend its borders. It can no longer have a police force to sort of track down, serious crime. And that's what the book's about. So it's dystopian, but it isn't. It just basically sort of says we could be in this position in a couple of years, not some future putative event. And I was very much concerned with the present rather than world building. I wasn't interested in world building a post dystopian society. I was interested in just turning up the present a notch. So although even I would admit that's a genre book, but it's a subversive genre book because it looks to subvert all 3 genres that it uses. But other than that, people would describe my work as literary fiction. And this is a label I really have difficulty with, because it seems to me, while there are quite clear guidelines whether you accept them or not, to things like romance, chick lit, supernatural, horror, crime, mystery, all of that. Literary fiction seems to me to be the label where you can't peg the book in any of those genres, so you lump it to this thing called literary fiction. So that's unsatisfactory. The next unsatisfactory thing about it is there seems to be a perception that genre books are not terribly literary. They just want to tell their story. And that literary fiction is really rubbish on story and rubbish on sort of page turning. It's all about interiority and stuff like that. There's no action. Now, there's absolutely no reason why literary fiction books can't retain their sort of, their use of imagery and metaphor and their sort of interiority and sort of depth of character psychology and be a page turner. In the same way as any genre book can aspire to high literary values in terms of its language use, its metaphor, its psychological depth. So, to me, again, that's an artificial divide. Unfortunately, it's true. There are a lot of books in both camps that don't do both, that are quite content to sit in their own little sort of sphere of genre books telling stories, being good yarns, and literary fiction books being, look at these, deep and profound observations as I stand in a field, but nothing else happens for 300 pages. But there are books that do both. So, for example, in science fiction, I would offer that Stanislaw Lem's Solaris and China Miéville's Ambassadors are both absolutely science fiction books and supreme works of literary ability. And that's why sort of China Miéville fans are always just decrying, why is China Miéville never nominated for literary prizes like the Booker and things like that? And, there's an argument there. For me, it's like, if we didn't have genre, that question wouldn't arise. So there's that. The other thing about genres is, I've listed the main ones, but then we have subgenres. So if you look at science fiction, it's no longer just, Robert Heinlein and Isaac Asimov and H.G. Wells' science fiction. It's now hard sci-fi, space opera, urban fantasy, science fiction fantasy, new weird, steampunk. Now, it's fine to have books written in these styles, but do we need to drill down from science fiction and have these formal entry requirements for a book to qualify as this? And the reason I say that is because this tendency tends to sort of lead to tribalism, whereby readers, and this is not an accusation at readers, this is merely the readers who are so passionate about their books that they go online on forums and social media to talk about the books that they love. But it tends to be in a tribal way, in the same way as supporting a football team or happened in the music industry with genre. It's the same thing. You get very entrenched in defending your patch, what you like. So, for example, fans of genres, these genres tend to have rules. The books must contain a certain element of this, that, and the other. And that's one of the things I was trying to sort of, deconstruct in my book, An Eye for an Eye for an Eye. And that, the debate coalesces around, well, does this book qualify for steampunk or whatever? Because although it observes the sort of Victorian technology, it's failing in some other way to observe the rules of propriety. And there should be no rules of entry. There should be no tramline ways that a book in a subgenre has to follow, even if it's like tearing down the rules, because it's just limiting. It's going to tend to make for books that are all the same. If they play by the same rules, yes, there's a difference of the character voice. That will differentiate books, but otherwise they're all doing the same thing. And it goes back to the bookshop idea. When I go to a bookshop, if I'm not looking for a specific book or a specific author I know, I go to the shelves that are called fiction, which is telling because they're not called literary fiction, they're just called fiction. But there'll be other sections, other stacks for crime thriller, romance, science fiction and all of that. And the point is, I will almost never go to those stacks because I know what I want and what I like is in my stacks. In the same way that someone who is browsing the crime fiction, I ask the question, will they ever go over to the general fiction and pick out, Joyce or... And that's not a criticism of them. In the same, I could be criticised the same way as I'm sort of closed-minded because I'm only looking at the fiction shelves. I'm not, there might be a crime thriller that's highly literary, and of course there's a history of highly literary crime thrillers. But again, it's this, it's this sort of labelling and division and atomization tendency, which means that we're all sort of vulnerable to this, of having sort of tunnel vision and not being open up to new experiences. I know there are plenty of readers who will read across all genres, and one week they'll read a romantic novel, and the next week they'll read a hard-boiled noir or whatever. So, respect to them. But I just think this tendency, and this all comes back again to marketing. How do bookshops, how are they able to display their wares in a legible way for readers to find them? But that goes back one stage further to the publishing houses, their marketing departments, saying, oh, you'll love this book. It's a noir thriller or a romantic thing, So telling bookshops where it should be shelved. And again, to me, it's just diminishing. I wish that books could just stand or fall on their own merits, that, there was just, fiction, and non-fiction. But, again, I appreciate that's not a practical thing. But it's a sort of, step-by-step sort of pernicious influence that then you lead to things like subgenre and this sort of, staking out of territory of, and sort of, expulsion of writers or readers who dare to question the conformist rules of being in that subgenre. So there you have it. I mean, I offer this. It doesn't come with any solutions because, there is an intractable problem of how do readers find books. And at the moment, genre labelling seems to be, one of the best solutions. I mean, I don't think it is, but I recognise that for the vast majority of book readers, it probably is the best method. I'm lucky in a way because when I go into bookshop, I know pretty much, if not the book I'm looking for, but at least the author I'm looking for. So, I don't have to browse terribly often amongst the great unknown, hoping to uncover a gem. But I throw it out there because I just want to encourage publishers, bookstores and readers and writers to a certain extent, if writers are charged with tagging their own genre. Let's just try and not limit ourselves and limit our vision when we approach books. A book is a book is a book. A work of fiction is a work of fiction. And the rest is just reductive, unfortunately. It doesn't help expand a book's sort of appeal to people who aren't acquainted with it. It's reductive. It actually closes off potential readers, potential buyers. And we're all at fault, all of us across the whole book industry. So there you have it. Obviously, I welcome your views down below. So till next time. Thanks very much.